motion to impound the police report that is attached, and the other is a protective order. I don't believe there's any objection from Mr. Velazos at this time. The Commonwealth is only asking this impoundment and this protective order take place during the pendency of the grand jury investigation, and we agree that once the grand jury has concluded its investigation, that information should be available.
Got no objection with the proviso as discussed with Councilor from Commonwealth that I'm allowed to review the contents of the reports I have with Mr. Willis.
Mr. Willis, the court has a complaint charging you with murder. The plea of not guilty is entered.
Thank you, Your Honor. The Commonwealth is requesting that the defendant be held without bail given the nature of the charges. I've spoken with counsel and we have an agreed upon, with the court's approval, probable cause date of January 2nd. I understand that counsel doesn't necessarily need to argue bail today, but if the court would like, I'm prepared to give Your Honor a very brief synopsis of the probable cause that brings the defendant before you today. Briefly. Thank you, Your Honor. Approximately 2 weeks ago, on the 12th of November, the victim, Patrick Sequeira Ferreira, who was 27 years old at the time, was shot and killed here in the city of Brockton on Keith Street. Police responded there after ShotSpotter detected 3 shots were fired in that area. The defendant before you was the last person to have phone conversation with the victim, and so he was the very first person that the police had interviewed. The text messages seem to appear that the defendant was arranging for an Uber to pick up the victim and bring him to his house. So when the police met with the defendant before you, he acknowledged that he knew the victim. Actually, rather uniquely, the defendant before you, until very recently, worked for the Office of Community Corrections, which is sort of a subset of the probation department here in Massachusetts. And he knew the victim because the victim was a client of OCC at the time. They struck up a friendship, which was against the policies and rules of the OCC. They began hanging out. Investigators learned that they hung out on a number of occasions. They may have smoked pot together on a number of occasions. And the defendant also told police that he had had sexual relations with the victim previous to that. It appears that no one in the defendant's family may have been aware that he was homosexual or bisexual, and it appears that the defendant before you may have been concerned that the victim was going to either tell people about their relationship or was going to tell people about their friendship having met at OCC, which would cause the defendant to be terminated from his job. The defendant expressed these concerns to the police when he was interviewed to them. It was also relayed to police through another witness, a friend of the victims, that this relationship existed and that the defendant would had some concern over people learning of the relationship and the nature of it. As the interview went on, it became apparent at some point that the defendant needed to be advised of his Miranda rights, so he was. And at that time, he asked that the police stop questioning him until he could have a lawyer present. So the interview was terminated. However, as the police were escorting the defendant out of the police station, he became very emotional and made spontaneous statements to the police. Quote, "I feel like scum. I didn't want to lie to you guys. I feel so awful. And I didn't call an Uber. I lied." Those statements were all spontaneous from the defendant as he was exiting the police station. Subsequent grand jury subpoena did in fact confirm some of those statements, that an Uber was never called, and that appeared to be some sort of ruse to get the victim to leave his home. What the police do know from witness interviews, phone records, and surveillance video was that ShotSpotter went off at 6:25 that night. We know that the defendant before you was dropped off approximately 15 minutes prior to the shooting in the area of the shooting by a friend of his who gave him a ride there. Surveillance video shows that after the friend dropped him off, the friend arrived at his girlfriend's house approximately 5 minutes away at 6:15 that evening. We know that there were 2 calls, one of them 1 minute after the shooting, where the defendant called his friend to come pick him up. It's a 17-second phone call. And then just a few minutes later, there's a 4-minute phone call where the defendant called that same friend and asked him to come pick him up near the same location where he had just dropped him off, which was the Huntington School in the city of Brockton. Huntington School was just at the end of the street where the shooting had occurred. It's also just a little over 1,000 feet from where the victim's home is, where he would have been coming out of that night. Surveillance video in the area put together from a couple locations shows police that there is a man that appears near that area in a time frame consistent with what the other evidence provides to us, that shows someone sort of lurking and hiding, perhaps looking out for someone just prior to the shots being fired. Another surveillance video does capture the victim walking down Keith Street on one side of the road and a male walking down behind him across the road. The male who we believe is the shooter, is closing the gap between the two, and at the last minute crosses over so that he's on the same side of the street as the victim and is directly behind him. They go out of view of that camera at that time. They are, however, picked up on a Brockton city camera, and that camera shows those two men, the victim and the shooter, meeting. However, those cameras are motion censored, and because at the time of the shooting no cars were driving down Main Street to set the sensors off, the camera freezes at that point, so we don't have surveillance video of the actual shot fired or flash or anything of that nature, but we have shot spotters that tell us exactly when that happened. Immediately after that, that same footage captures the same male suspect running back down Keith Avenue in the direction of Warren Avenue to the location, in the direction of the location where the defendant is picked up minutes later after making that 4-minute phone call to his friend saying that he needs to be picked up right away outside that location. So that information is also corroborated by phone records that the police obtained pursuant to a search warrant. They know that when the defendant made those calls, not only from his friend where he was, but he's pinging off a tower at 138 Main Street, which is the closest tower to the murder scene. And so we know definitively that the defendant is in that area. This information and the report that you have in front of you establishes probable cause that the defendant is either the shooter or at the least at the area and involved in the shooting in so much as he has a motive to want to kill the victim, and he may have been there simply to notify another person who the victim was and to order the shot. But he also, at this point, we have not ruled out that he is actually the shooter involved in this. Either way, under Massachusetts law and under the joint venture instruction, Your Honor, the Commonwealth Police is probable cause to establish that the defendant has violated Mass General laws, and that is that he has committed murder against the victim. If there are any further questions that the court has about the details of the investigation, we have provided a probable cause report for the court's consideration as well. We would ask that you hold the defendant without bail. I certainly recognize, Your Honor,